You know, the late 1990s was quite a time for the Sonic franchise. After the release and success of Sonic and Knuckles, Sonic Team slowly realized that 2D was getting out of the main spotlight, and so they had separate attempts at developing 3D Sonic games, which brought games like Sonic the Fighters and Sonic R. Eventually, in 1998, they released Sonic Adventure for the Sega Dreamcast, and it was massively successful. People loved the game, and 27 years later, I really have to ask, is this game really all that good? To be honest, my first experience with the game was absolutely awful, but after giving the game another chance with visual mods and actually completing the game, I have to say that Sonic Adventure isn't just a masterpiece, but also an intellectual genius. The amount of design with this game is beyond anything I've ever seen, and I can confidently say that it is one of the best Sonic games of all time. But at the same time, some aspects of the game are so unbelievably trash, I am actually appalled that this isn't Sonic Adventure. Let's talk about it. Funnily enough, we begin Sonic's story with a boss fight. It's Chaos Zero, and frankly, as a boss, it isn't very good. It has 3 separate attacks, and all of them are extremely predictable. That's not even mentioning the third attack that can take a lot of time with him jumping up on the light poles constantly, so it becomes very boring, since you're just running around. But as a whole segment of Sonic's story, and given the context and placement of this boss, I don't think it's all that bad. I like to think of this as a way to master the controls of the game, as other than Chaos Zero, there aren't any hazards in the area, and all of Sonic-based moves work here. And also, there's a good chance that if you decide to beat Chaos Zero as soon as possible, you don't actually have to see the attack that takes a long amount of time. So, overall, I do think that the Chaos Zero boss fight is decent. For newer players, it just gives them freedom to move around more easily. As from now on, when we review from zone to zone, we can't just review the zone itself. We also now have to review the way you get to the zone. The reason why is because for some levels like Windy Valley, getting to the level can be somewhat difficult, while others like Ice Cap can be a lot more frustrating to get to. As for Emerald Coast, it's extremely easy to get to. It's very obvious and not confusing in the slightest. It's positioned where any normal player would head first, so it's a very good entrance. Now we can move on to the zone, and this is hands down one of the best zones in the entire game. It has separate routes and secrets everywhere. The level has different set pieces like the Orca and the huge loop you go into multiple times. It's honestly some of the best things I've seen from 3D Sonic. The music also nicely reflects that because it's very calm and there's a lack of energy, which fits the level very well. There's even some skips you can perform, like instead of just going around the structure the normal way, you can just do a well-timed spin dash and skip it all, and if you fall down here with momentum, you land on the edge of a section later in the level. Overall, this is a very good zone, with my only real problem being the zone itself is a little short. I'd love to see this be expanded upon. After Emerald Coast, Sonic goes to the Mystic Ruins and meets Eggman there. Overall, it doesn't really take all that much to find, just head to the Mystic Ruins and head to an open area next to the stairs. It can be really annoying to barely miss the area you need to get to, since the only thing this call says is that you should go to the Mystic Ruins, but you're most likely going to end up running into it by accident. And the boss itself is exactly what it needs to be. It's an actual boss this time, unlike the Chaos Zero fight, and it has a very easy pattern to follow. So, it's also a good boss. Not great because there's a lack of new things to see, but considering the type of boss fights we had before this, I'm just surprised we have 2 at least decent boss fights in a row without any sort of asterisks. Well, this is where I start to have a problem with how you get to the zones. For me personally, after the Egg Hornet boss, I never actually thought to check more into the Mystic Ruins. Plus, I feel like the area where they not only put the Wind Key, but also the crack in the wall to get to Windy Valley in the first place, can be extremely annoying to find. The Wind Key blends in unbelievably well with Tails' workshop, and when looking for the cave opening in order to enter Windy Valley, it is really hard to see if looking from where you got the key in the first place. And that's if you even have an inkling of what to do, because in my first ever playthrough of the game, I immediately went straight back to Station Square. I will admit that the placement of the key isn't that bad, especially since that's where the developers probably expected you to go, but it took me quite a while to get to Windy Valley in the first place. But the complete opposite stands for the zone itself, because Windy Valley is one of the best zones I've played. It's very similar to Emerald Coast, but has a lot more action in it, with running down huge slopes, wind carrying you on leaves, secret entrances which aren't necessarily secret pathways but are still really cool, and did I mention there's a whole tornado section? As I said, it's a lot less explorative than Emerald Coast and a lot more linear, but it's still overall one of the best zones of Sonic Adventure, even with the other characters. Following Windy Valley, we go straight into another zone. Now, the way to get into this zone isn't really all that confusing, but it can take a while. You need to find a way to get into the sewers, and that'll get you the Lightspeed Shoes ability. You then find a way into the different section of Station Square where Casinopolis is located, either that being through the route available in the Station Square train station or the area that connects Station Square to Emerald Coast. So overall, the way to get to the zone isn't all too bad, save for the actual entrance into the sewers, which I always thought was this place behind Twinkle Park. The zone itself just doesn't feel all too right with me. It just feels like a huge waste of time. Yes, I always love the idea of having a lot of rings at hand, but it's so unnecessary to have this be considered a zone at all. It's not like any other zone in the game, and it doesn't have any level design, just having the overall level be a gimmick on its own. All in all, I don't like this zone nearly as much as the first two. And I feel it's completely understandable, especially if you don't know the best way to finish the stage fast, which leads me to purposefully losing the Nights and Dreams area to get down underground and collect all the ring boxes underneath. For somebody like me who has no real interest in watching the story of Sonic Adventure, this was one of the worst times to beat me. If you skipped all the cutscenes after Casinopolis and were like me and didn't want to look up how to get to the next part of the game, you're screwed because the ice key is left in one of the most hidden spots in the entirety of Sonic's story. It's in between a bunch of buildings in the Casinopolis area, but if you're not looking for it, then I'll be sure you won't find it either. Its color is also of no help at all, something that will be a recurring issue as Sonic's story progresses. From there, I think it's pretty normal to assume players would go back to the Mystic Ruins. The cutscenes with the rocks happen, and it's right in front of them as they launch off the stairs, so from there, it's really easy. And I don't get it. I understand that it's my fault for not sitting back and watching the cutscene unfold, but at the very least, Twinkle should have given a more helpful hint. I almost gave up playing this on the first playthrough because it was extremely frustrating. Ice Cap itself though is amazing. The beginning has a huge open section where Sonic is outside before he enters the cavern and finally has a snowboarding section at the end. The level part of the zone isn't all too special, but it's Sonic Adventure, so you know there's secrets and reasons to go out of your way to get them. Overall, it's also a banger zone, though it's considerably worse than Windy Valley and Emerald Coast, because it's a lot more uninteresting than the other two. It's still a great zone though. Finding this boss fight isn't all too difficult, because there's no hints around and Knuckles is just standing there without anything else. At this point in the game, you realize that if there's a general area, the next thing you need to do is most likely still in that general area, unless the game moves you. Either way, this is overall not a good fight by any means. This continues the trend where character fights are extremely easy, even more so than the previous ones one could argue, and it took me 30 seconds to beat. Which if beating a Sonic boss in 30 seconds isn't impressive, then there's a massive problem. Not a lot to talk about here, just a very boring boss. It's not good in any way. After the Knuckles fight, we fight Chaos 4, and this boss, while definitely better than the boss before it, isn't by much. There's no finding the zone as after a cutscene you get transported right to the boss, so there's nothing to talk about there. The boss itself though, isn't my favorite. A lot of that comes down to the fact that movement inside the boss can be extremely annoying. I'm not even really sure how the water really works and why you sink, but standing makes you sink and walking is extremely slow. Other than that, the boss fight itself just has a very long attack cycle, so it gets very boring and annoying fast. It's by far the worst boss in Sonic's story, just because something as simple as basic movement is made difficult in it. Afterward, Sonic and Tails chase Eggman off with a tornado, and I feel it's overall very mixed. I like the idea of it, the controls are really well made and the depth perception isn't all too bad, but I feel like these sections are way too long compared to how long they should be. When you take the spectacle of the act away, you're really just shooting missiles, and it's especially annoying when you reach the end of the ship, think that the act is finally over, only for you to flip around, which looks really weird and messes with one's perception, and you have to go back and drive through the section all over again. I don't think it's one of the worst zones in Sonic's story, but it's definitely up there. Returning to the traditional layout of zones, Twinkle Park is one of the better zones in Sonic's story. The way you get to it is extremely easy. You enter at the building you aim at, and when you combine that with the fact that you land right next to Emerald Coast, finding this area should most of the time not be frustrating in any way. And Twinkle Park itself is absolutely amazing. The first half of the zone is good enough on its own. Even though there's not much to do here, the visuals are nice, and it's a good place to pick up some rings and lives. The second part is where the zone really shines though. It's very vertical, and even though that means you can fall down a long way and have to do things all over again, you can always improve, and generally there's a limit to how far you can actually fall. The visuals are amazing. There's tight platforming mixed in with exploration and speed, and it's overall one of my favorite zones in Sonic's story, right up there with Emerald Coast and another zone we'll be talking about shortly. All in all, a near perfect zone that uses fun gimmicks and Sonic's level design very well. Now this is the absolute pinnacle of Sonic Adventure. After leaving the Twinkle Park building, you need to collect this ID card in order to enter Speed Highway. Now, with the wrong time of day, this can be a bit weird to locate since the area around it has white edges, but considering the chances of you not at least catching a glimpse of this area is near impossible, even when you decide to skip the cutscene as it starts, and the fact that it's not hidden away in a corner like the ice key really makes it more of a straightforward way to progress the story. And speaking of the level, oh my goodness, they really just took the speed aspect of Sonic's moves and cranked it up so much. At the very beginning of the zone, there's a huge jump you can do because of the downward slope, and it feels so good every time. To jump up on the buildings and do a spin dash in order to skip some sections of the level. And even other than that, the level design is so good. It's a lot more emphasized on speed, but it feels like you need to quickly react to a piece of the level design in order to take a different route. Not that there aren't any different routes at all. Not to mention, the set pieces this zone have are amazing. The helicopter, the chasing down the building, heck, the entire last segment of the zone itself could be considered a set piece of level, but the point is that Speed Highway does it right by taking a single aspect of Sonic and expanding upon it, making it an absolute blast to play through. Overall, I wouldn't say I'd like every single zone in this game to be like Speed Highway, but this is the best that Sonic Adventure in its entirety has to offer. And talk about consistency, because even though I believe Speed Highway is better than Red Mountain, it isn't by all that much. But one thing I will say is that the way you get to Red Mountain has to be one of the most infuriating sections of Sonic's story. Because not only have we not gone to a section that we've already went to before, but with the absolutely dastardly hint to call Getty to hurry up and get to the top of the mountain, you'd think you'd need to actually climb the mountain you see, or at the very least, go into this area which we've never been told to go to before, and likely this is also your first time seeing it. But no. You're supposed to enter the ice cap area, go past the level, enter Angel Island through the now open door which you would have had no way of knowing, get a new ability which if you're moving just decently fast can be very difficult to find, and then use that to defeat the enemy in the cage to then finally get to Red Mountain. You see, it's things like this that make playing this game for the first time extremely annoying, because if you're like me and you don't want to have to constantly look up for the answers on the internet, then you have no choice but to find your way around this extremely convoluted sequence of steps to just progress the story. And I feel I really do need to mention Tikal, because I assume they already figured that it would be difficult for the player to know what to do next, hence why Tikal gives hints, and for the most part, they are true, and it's not like she's lying to you. You do use Red Mountain to reach the top, but the hints are so extremely vague that they're borderline not hints at all, and this is a problem for each and every single segment where you need to do something before a level can happen. But for Red Mountain, it is excruciating because of all the reasons I listed above. The zone though, more than makes up for it. What Speed Highway had in speed with its high-action platforming, changing routes, and dodging obstacles, Red Mountain takes a different approach with more thought-provoking level design. Sure, it's very clear where you need to go, so you can play this without thinking all too much, but when you realize that every single section of this level can be used to create new opportunities to make skips, the level opens into a totally different perspective. Suddenly, these rocks are super boring as you can jump across if you have the momentum and strategy is put into place. The first section of the stage is a lot more linear, having the main goal to be pressing switches to open rockets that can let you move vertically, and for the majority of it, it's the same thing. But once you enter underground and get into the lava section, this is where Red Mountain shines. Sure, you can spin dash jump quite frequently, but unlike Speed Highway, where we have these segments where you can comfortably charge a max power spin dash and be somewhat okay, Red Mountain requires thinking, stopping at the right time, having the right elevation, and it just makes every successful jump feel all that more rewarding, something not present in Speed Highway. And again, I love Speed Highway, but I feel Red Mountain does this better, since it's not explicitly shown where you're supposed to be able to do this. Overall, again, the segment before getting to Red Mountain can be extremely infuriating, but the level itself is again of the best that Sonic Adventure has to offer. I hate this. I hate this. Yeah, there's no real segue into this section of the review because there shouldn't even be one. It's just the same Sky Chase sequence but darker now, so a lot of things are quite difficult to see properly now. It's even longer than before, and there's even a section where a cutscene plays where the tornado transforms into its battle mode, giving a false sense of the level finally being over. But no, it isn't, and you have to go past the entire ship another 2 times just for this section to be over. And the boss that's at the end of the act is horrendous. I get it, the whole point of the boss is that you're not supposed to get hit with the laser, but that doesn't mean you're supposed to get away with doing that. At the very least, make it so that if you and Eggman just throw projectiles at each other constantly, that Eggman will win the battle. Or if you don't want to buff the boss, then make so that you get spun off to the side or something. I think this takes the crown for the worst part of Sonic's story, simply because there's absolutely no good from it. Ironically enough, the more altitude we gain in the game, the more the levels keep dropping in quality and enjoyment. Do you remember the absolute masterpieces that were Red Mountain and Speed Highway? Well, not anymore, because even though the way to get to Skydeck isn't all that complicated, it's right in front of you, and if you happen to run by, a cutscene plays where Sonic himself says that this must be the entrance to Skydeck, the level itself is not pleasant in any sort of way. The first part of the level has this habit of slowing you down to do this extremely annoying platforming, and repeating level assets and design over and over again, especially towards the end, which has a gimmick that's nice in conception but was horribly executed. The problem is, you either outrun the cannon from the get-go, and you're never even able to see the explosion, or you're unlucky enough to get hit from around the most left of the blast range, get hit down the floor, and just keep getting hit, unable to get out of range until you eventually die. The second part of the zone is a lot better, but it still has its problems. The wind wasn't all too much of a problem. I believe it barely affects Sonic, and considering the controls and the physics, I think it's better like that. On the other hand, the cannon here isn't better than the last. Having us run around in circles is never fun, and towards the end, the section where random bits of the level design fall can be very infuriating the first time around, especially since you can easily get stuck with no way out. And the third section plays with rotation of gravity, and the camera does not make this nice at all. Combine all this into one drag of a zone, and with the fact that literally skipping the entire third section is more fun, we get the worst main zone in Sonic's story. Next. This fight isn't all too much, but it's a lot better than what we just experienced. The whole point is that there's these little ice machines that we need to use in order to freeze Chaos, which then makes it vulnerable to attacks. This is by far the best Chaos boss fight out of all the ones we've seen, but I personally feel it's kind of a bummer that we're this far into the game and the best boss we've played against is still the Egg Hornet. It's still a very decent boss fight with a very good concept, but it just falls flat on its face. After Sonic beats Chaos 6, Sonic lands in the Mystic Ruins, and the next zone, Lost World, isn't all that difficult to find. You need to get through the jungle in order to find the structure that has the entrance to Lost World. And honestly, while it might seem like something I'll complain about, I do think that here it's a lot better than it may seem. While looking from above the jungle, you can very clearly see the structure which towers over everything, and you already spawned near the ladder that takes you to the top where you can overview everything. Add this to the fact that it's sometimes possible for you to jump onto the jungle trees, meaning you can easily jump your way straight to the structure from the get-go, and even if you don't, so as long as you keep a very light mental note of where you're going, or at the very least do not run in circles, it is a very easy navigation process. I'm not gonna say I like it, because frankly the whole idea of having to do all these unnecessary actions in order to progress can feel very annoying at times, especially when you're on your first playthrough, but its offenses are a lot less than others. The level itself though, it's mixed in my opinion. The first section is okay enough, but I feel things start to fall apart when you enter this water section. It's not the pressing of buttons that get me, it's the fact that the depth perception for the snake can be really annoying at times, and the fact that if you just so happen to slip, you have to start this entire section all over again just doesn't sit right with me. And following that is this dark area, where you can either stop and put the beams into the mirror for the place to light up, or you can trudge into the darkness and go in on your own, relying on your prior knowledge. Losing sight, but if done properly, saves seconds of time, is what I would say if they didn't decide to spam the crap out of the fire enemies. This already wasn't a very fun segment of the level, but I can somewhat get behind the fact that without experience you'll have the short end of the stick, but once you do, you'll be able to go past with little effort. But what they did here is make so that if you even dare to step off the ground, there will always be a fire enemy meant to knock you once you land, and that's the best case scenario, as this can also knock you into the water, having you restart this entire section all over again. And this also applies for the novices too. It's just a very tedious section to do, and it doesn't get much better. We enter a rock chasing sequence, which in itself is pretty cool, but if you're not prepared, this can easily get you. But thankfully, there's a checkpoint right before. Then we enter the final area, where you need to use the gravity mechanic in order to climb up and proceed. It's a pretty cool concept and was executed properly, but at this point in the level, there's been so many unnecessary gimmicks and set pieces that Lost World as a whole doesn't really feel like any Sonic Adventure level. Overall, it's not any Skydeck or Sky Chase act, but it definitely has a lot of glaring issues. Thankfully, the way to Final Egg is actually really easy. It's right next to the area with Lost World, and if you're paying good attention after the cutscene, you'll already see the blaring lights. Even for those who thought they didn't have any reason to continue being in the Mystic Ruins, all it takes is you either randomly stumbling into the area, or for you climbing up the ladder to return, looking back, and just taking that route to find it. A fun tip. If you don't actually really want to go around and enter the maze, all you need to do is stand across the edges of the map, and it's very likely you'll stay on top, since there are no destinations the map leads to. And speaking of the zone itself, I am absolutely baffled. They actually managed to make a good, challenging yet fair final act, which when you have the right experience, can help you skip certain sections. Right off the bat, I'm gonna say I don't necessarily like this zone, but it did what it was supposed to do exceptionally, and I love it for that. The platforming in this level is actually quite precise, even having sections where there are obstacles blocking your jump. So you need to strategize and think not just about your trajectory, but when you jump. There's also occasional speed sections where you're able to move quickly, so that the level doesn't lose the root of it being a Sonic level, and while it does have its fair share of gimmicks, they all serve purposes we are very familiar with. The spider thing, for example, just acts like an elevator, and it feels incorporated so properly into the level, in theming and progression. There's also these rooms where you can spam your homing attack on all these enemies that continuously spawn, and I just love it. It's so fun to just spam the A button and watch all these little pink guys disappear. Not to mention, this level is kinda long. My playthrough of it was 5 minutes, and I've already played this twice before, so it's a very nice experience and it put my skills of the game to the test, something a final act should always do. Overall, it is the best final act the series has seen up until this point. And now, your entire 90-minute journey culminates at this final battle, and it's sadly the best boss in Sonic's story. It's not sad because it's good. No, I think this boss is great. But I feel sad about this fact because after the Egg Hornet, the third segment of the game, nothing can top it until the final boss. Context aside though, this boss fight is amazing. There's a clear set of easy to dodge attacks, hard to dodge attacks and unavoidable sequences. The variety of the boss is amazing. Almost every attack feels extremely fair and unavoidable with the right play. The phases build up the difficulty smoothly. Heck, at the very end of the fight, he doesn't just explode, he actually tries to straight up bring Sonic down with him. The only real problem I have with this boss is the unforgiving nature of the void, because if you get hit the wrong way just once, that's straight to the void for you. Overall, the perfect final boss that I found myself raging at, but I also felt myself getting better and better, seeing his attacks come before they happen, anticipating that he's going to destroy the edge of the platforms, knowing when to jump so that you can get the best case scenario of spinning on the rotating mechanism so that hits are easy to control, even baiting out his last attack. It is one of the best final fights I've played in Sonic when it comes to simplicity and functionality. Sonic's story all in all is a really good experience, with its biggest shortcomings being that of length in some boring areas, but it's very polished and presentable. But I feel like if you really want to experience Sonic Adventure at its best, you need to go through the worst, because playing the game the very first time can be one of the worst playthroughs simply because of how horrible the game is at actually telling you where to go, and this might be the reason why some people dislike the game. But I promise you, trudge on, or at the very least watch a walkthrough on YouTube, because this game has some of the best things Sonic has to offer. However, Sonic, while being the main attraction of the game, isn't the only playable character in the game. Let's continue on the review with Tails' story.